What is the rabbi's approach towards the Chabad movement?
That is a very good question. Frankly, it is such a good question that an entire book would be necessary to fully answer and deal with all aspects of this issue. But of course we don't have a whole book, we don't have the time for that, so let us try and make a few salient points. Let us begin by admitting something which many Torah Jews, I think, might be surprised to hear and are unlikely to be willing to admit to. But let us begin by admitting that Galuth Judaism, Galuth-based Judaism, or that which I have often referred to as Galuth mode Judaism, is not terribly exciting. And let me try to explain what I mean by that. If a system is based on certain premises, certain postulates, and is designed to function a certain reality, and in point of fact that system exists in a different reality altogether, dealing with different circumstances as compared to the original assumptions of that system, it follows that that system will not be entirely satisfactory. What I mean to say by that is that the essence, the absolute basic assumption of Judaism, of Torah Judaism, is that the Jewish people received the Torah. That Torah is the foundation and the source from which all of Jewish civilization and culture and life and meaning flow, and that according to that culture and civilization, based on that Torah, the Jewish people are supposed to be a sovereign nation in their land, living according to the precepts and concepts and commandments of the Torah. And by so doing, there will be a light to the nations. That is the absolute bedrock of Torah Judaism. Everything about the Torah is based on that set of assumptions and ideas. Everything is predicated on that. Judaism broke down for the first time over 2,500 years ago, when the Jewish people, by and large, were exiled from their land, from Eretz Yisrael, and found themselves in Babel, in Babylon, in Persia, and other places. There was an attempt, which was only partially successful, to reconstitute authentic Torah Judaism and the national life of the Jewish people in Eretz Yisrael, some 70-odd years, beginning 70-odd years later. And that attempt, which lasted for hundreds of years, we generally refer to as the Second Temple period, Tekufat Beit Sheni in Hebrew. But this was only partially successful because the Jewish people, a large percentage of the Jewish people, remained in the reality and in the environment of Galuth. And then the second Mikdash, the second temple, was destroyed, and over a period of many more centuries, the reality, the on-the-ground presence of the Jewish people in their land dwindled to the point that roughly 1,000 years ago there were very few Jews in Eretz Yisrael. In other words, the Jewish people has experienced the breakdown of its system, of its civilization, of its culture, of its Torah, many times in the past, and this became, to a large extent, in the minds of many, this became the norm. In other words, the reality of a machine that is broken down, or that is working only at a very low capacity, instead of working at 100%, it's working at 15%, that reality became the norm for many people. And as a result, Torah Judaism became, in the minds and in the lives of most Jews, the vast majority of Jews in fact, over time, because this became the only reality that Jewish people knew, Torah Judaism became something else, something different from what it was supposed to be. And this led to a total corruption and misconception as regards to what Torah Judaism is truly about. And this led to what Shabtai ben Dov refers to as the aslut hagalutif, the indolence of the galuth. That is to say, the Jewish people, to a large extent, came to terms with the reality of Galuth Judaism. This became the norm, and anything beyond that this norm lacking in great part the essential elements of authentic Judaism, this norm became entirely accepted and reasonable in the eyes of most people. And the Jewish people essentially fell into a kind of stupor. This point is made by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi in his famous work, the Kuzari, where towards the end the Jewish sage who is speaking to the king of the Khazar people says that whereas based on everything I've been telling you, you, the king of the Khazars, based on what I've been telling you, we, the Jewish people, should be striving in a practical, down-to-earth way to leave the Galuth and return to Eretz Yisrael and to reconstitute our existence, our national existence, our national life, our culture, our civilization, in accordance with the destiny and the vision laid out in the Torah by Hashem. Despite the fact that this is what we should be doing, unfortunately this is not what we are doing. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is the first to make this point so powerfully, in such a blunt fashion, one could say. He says the Jewish people should be doing A, but in fact they are doing B. What they're doing is sitting in the Galuth, remaining in the Galuth, also suffering, one could add, in the Galuth, and not doing anything about it, and expecting somehow that things will right themselves. If you add to this the sufferings, the persecutions, the pogroms, the massacres, the inquisitions, etc., etc., the crusades that the Jewish people had to suffer at different places and different times in history, then we really have a system that is entirely broken down. This is something that all Jews, particularly Torah Jews, need to understand. The Jewish system, what is supposed to be the flawless, divinely inspired system known as Torah Judaism, broke down entirely. Not only were the Jewish people living in the wrong place, not only were they being persecuted and suffering, they were even doing nothing about it. They somehow had come to accept that this was normal, that this was their lot. And that is, of course, a system which is, therefore, can be said quite objectively to have broken down. One of the results of this state of affairs was that in different parts of the Jewish world, in different points in history, false messiahs arose, claiming to be the Messiah who would, people would arise claiming to be the Messiah who would somehow miraculously lead the Jewish people out of exile and return them to Eretz Yisrael and rebuild the Mikdash, the temple. All kinds of promises and claims were made. The situation in the Galuth, in the exile, became so dire, so dark, and so depressing, and so frankly dangerous and intolerable for the Jewish people, that increasingly Jews began to despair. On the one hand, they were in an impossible situation. On the other hand, they were doing nothing about it to remove themselves from that reality. They somehow felt that there was nothing they could do. And one of the upshots of this state of affairs, this despair, was an increasing belief in many circles that the exile will come to an end, and the Mashiach would be some kind of supernatural, miraculous figure, personality, and the entire salvation of the Jewish people would be of a miraculous and supernatural nature. That has had nothing to do with real-world activities or efforts. And this point of view was further disseminated and strengthened by the increasing influence of various circles of Kabbalistic thinking, circles of Kabbalists who existed in different places in the Jewish world. I'm talking now about the Middle Ages and the late Middle Ages, and as a result of this, more and more Jews became convinced that the salvation of the Jewish people, the Geula, the redemption, was entirely tied up with spiritual efforts and mystical endeavors. The most well-known of these episodes that resulted from this type of approach is known as the well-known episode of Shabtai Tzvi, who in the year 1660, according to the Christian calendar, was brought before the Sultan, the head of the Ottoman Empire, and having fermented much unrest and anticipation and excitement amongst the Jews in the Ottoman Empire, and there were many, many Jews living in various areas of the Ottoman Empire. The Jews had been whipped up by Shabtai Tzvi and his followers, had been whipped up into some kind of a frenzy, messianic frenzy. He was brought before the Sultan and was asked what exactly he wanted. And when, of course, he couldn't really explain what he wanted, because such form of redemption, such a Geula, does not really exist except in the minds and the imaginations of misguided people. In other words, his study of Kabbalah, for example, of Shabtai Tzvi's his knowledge of Kabbalah, the fact that his followers were known as Zoharistan, people who studied the Zohar, and their belief that it was this kind of study and different forms of mystical activity that would bring about the Geula in some miraculous way. All of this, of course, led to nothing material, and therefore he was considered to be a nuisance and a danger to the stability of the regime, and he was offered the choice to either be executed or convert to Islam and to put an end to this nonsense. And he, as is known, chose to convert to Islam. And this was this caused a great wave of dismay in much of the Jewish world. This entire historical episode, by the way, has been largely hushed up by the Jewish establishment, by the Torah establishment, for some hundreds of years now, because of the many questions that it raises. But those are the historical facts in brief. And it is no accident that shortly after this time, the Baal Shem Tov appeared on the scene with some new ideas, also based on mystical thought and practice, and it caught on. One of the reasons it caught on was that the Jews were suffering tremendously. The Jewish people, in almost all parts of the world, wherever Jews were suffering, were being persecuted. Certainly their lives were not easy, to put it mildly. In some places they were being persecuted and even killed in large numbers. In other places they were being downtrodden, forced to live in ghettos, and Jewish existence altogether was not a very pleasant business, was not a happy affair. Any kind of mystical teaching which can serve to negate the negativity of existence, any kind of teaching and spiritual Torah-based activity which could provide some solace for the Jews so suffering, would be readily accepted, and it was. This does not, by the way, I should mention here, this does not prove or doesn't necessarily lead one to the conclusion that everything the Baal Shem Tov was saying was not true. I'm not suggesting that. I am suggesting that the fact that these teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, which led to the creation of what is known as the Hasidic movement, these things took root in the Jewish people, in many parts of the Jewish world, because they did provide such solace and allowed people to detach themselves from the negative reality of their lives. Nevertheless, reality remains the reality. No amount of mystical musings or teachings or study of Kabbalah or Hasidut could change the reality. The reality was dark and dire. So the Jewish reality, the experience of Jewish existence in the Galuth, continued to be, overall, a very difficult and negative experience. Some Jews found themselves drawn towards these Hasidic teachings, and other Jews did not feel themselves so drawn or were opposed to these teachings. Either way, the reality for all remained far from satisfactory, to put it mildly. And this is how Jewish history continued for another several generations, until starting in Germany towards the end of the 18th century and gaining speed and impetus in the 19th century, more and more Jews began to have serious questions about Judaism. That is to say, what exactly are we supposed to be doing? How do we change the reality of Judaism? As we mentioned, the straightforward answer to that, which is to, by hook or by crook, by whatever means available, to leave the Galuth, return to Eretz Yisrael, and to begin to reconstitute the Jewish people's national existence as laid out in the Torah. This was not immediately obvious to people, and many Jews began to question what exactly is the purpose of remaining Jewish, and what will be the end of all this unsatisfactory Jewish experience. What will it lead to? Some Jews decided to simply leave Judaism. The negativity of the situation was too great for them, or they were lured by other systems of thought or what have you. They wish to be accepted by non-Jewish society. They wish to better their physical realities of their lives, and this led them to abandon Judaism altogether. Or they simply saw that the Jewish people had broken down. As we said before, the system had broken down when it was beyond repair. Other Jews continued to believe that by being observant, Torah observant, and by studying mystical studies and teachings and dealing with such things, that one was causing the Geula to come ever closer. And other Jews simply assumed and knew that the Galut, the exile, was foretold in the Torah and eventually must come to an end. And we need to remain good, observant, faithful Jews and wait for something to happen, basically. But this approach, these kinds of approaches, were not viewed by other Jews as being satisfactory. Some Jews found all these responses to be unsatisfactory. So as we said, those who basically gave up on being Jewish disappeared and they assimilated. Others, even though they decided that the fault was with Torah Judaism itself, the system was broken down because the system was not good and could not be fixed, on the other hand, they could not free themselves, they could not rid themselves of their Jewish identity or their wish to somehow continue their existence as Jews. And this of course led eventually to the advent of the Zionist movement. The Zionist movement was a movement established by assimilated Jews who had turned their backs on Judaism but not on their Jewishness. Those who had turned their backs on Jewishness simply left the Jewish people, assimilated into this or that European nation. Those who did not find that a reasonable or desirable solution insisted on remaining Jewish, but not according to the precepts and the concepts and the aims of Judaism. Now you may be asking yourself at this point, well, this is all very interesting, but what has it got to do with Chabad Judaism, the Chabad version of Judaism? Well, the answer to that is as follows. Whereas some Jews, sometimes called mitnagdim, misnagdim, in other words, or Lithuanian Jews, in other words, Jews who simply continued the usual and traditional form of Galuth mode Judaism without any Hasidic influences. Some Jews of that type, the Jews of that type, I should say, knew that Jewish existence is unsatisfactory. That is why they davened every day for all kinds of things that were not part of their Jewish existence. They davened for returning to Eretz Yisrael, even though they really perhaps could have done so themselves, or they could have tried, or they could have spoken about it a lot more, at least. But they davened, they prayed to be able to return to Eretz Yisrael. They prayed for the reconstitution of a Jewish state, and the laws of the Torah, in which the laws of the Torah would be implemented. They prayed for the Malchut Beth David, the Davidic dynasty, and the sovereign existence of the Jewish people. They prayed for the Mikdash, for the temple. So they knew that something was missing. Judaism had not fulfilled its aims and its purposes on this earth as defined by Judaism itself, and as these people knew, they were praying for something that was not there every day, and they were willing to wait. Other Jews, on the other hand, were not so willing to wait. So some decided to become secular Jews, but they wanted to remain Jewish, and they didn't really feel they fitted in these various anti-Semitic European countries, so they became secular Zionists. In the case of Chabad, what developed over a number of generations was an entirely different approach, and it is the approach that I refer to as replacement theology of Chabad. Everybody, of course, is familiar with the concept of replacement theology. This refers to the claims of Christianity that the Christians replaced the Jewish people as those who had a special connection with God, with Hashem. A concept, of course, which the Jewish people have always rejected. I refer here, I use the same term, I borrow the term to refer to something else. I refer here to the replacement of the fundamental and essential notions and concepts of Torah Judaism, particularly with reference to the concepts of Geula, redemption, the Mashiach, the Messiah, and what exactly the Jewish people are striving for, what is missing, and how to go about doing something about it. My perception is that Chabad has developed over a period of several generations, particularly the last two leaders of the Chabad movement. They developed a system which is essentially a kind of replacement theology. What do I mean by this? I'm sure this sounds rather strange to many ears, so I will try and explain myself. Whereas a so-called Litai, Lithuanian or non-Hasidic Jew, shall we say, knows, at least on paper, that his Jewish existence, his personal Jewish existence as in his own life, and the existence of the Jewish people as a whole is definitely lacking and missing huge parts, huge chunks of the vision and the purpose and the self-described aims and destinies of the Jewish people, and therefore such a person prays for such things, at the very least pays lip service to these things, and probably would like to see them happen, but will not do anything about making them happen. And whereas perhaps other Jews gave up on the whole concept of redemption and the Jewish people's continued existence, and opted out of the Jewish people and assimilated, and others still chose to redefine Judaism as some kind of a secular identity and reality, and this, amongst other things, led to the Zionist movement. Chabad developed a different response to all of this. The basic feeling of lack of satisfaction, lack of fulfillment, and the impossibility of continued exile-based Jewish existence, of accepting this, acquiescing to such a thing, and coming to terms with it. The impossibility of such a thing led to a number of developments in Chabad. We see that Chabad are unhappy and unfulfilled by the usual reality of Galuth mode Judaism, and we see therefore that Chabad is always trying to come up with something new, something different, even when it comes to something on the one hand small, or apparently what some people might think unrelated, but in fact very much related. Even when it comes to something like the idea of Jews studying Rambam, Mishneh Torah of the Rambam on a daily basis. This was an idea that began in Chabad. It had also to do with their Mashiach or Geula-based agenda, because they did not accept, Chabad did not, has not for a long time, does not accept today the standard position of Torah Judaism as it developed in the Galuth, namely wait and do nothing, and continue to be an observant Jew, and things will work themselves out one way or another. In other words, Sheva al Ta'aseh. This was not acceptable. This became unacceptable in Chabad circles. So they were constantly pushing the envelope. Learning Rambam had to do with getting to that place in the Rambam, in Chot Melachim or Milhamot, where he talks about things to do with the Mashiach. This was part of the motivation for for studying the Rambam. It was not to know the Rambam's halachic position on this or that issue pertaining to Idchot Shabbat, or this or that issue pertaining to Ma'achalot Asurot, to what is kosher or what is not kosher. It had everything to do with getting Jews to learn Idchot Melachim or Milhamot, where the Rambam discusses things to do with the Mashiach. Because Chabad basically decided, of course it's not really a decision, it's not a conscious decision, but in practice the direction became one of replacing the waiting mode of Torah Judaism with declaring that we have already entered a new stage, a new reality. We are no longer really in the Galuth, or we're on the very, very threshold of leaving the Galuth, and we are about to enter a new period. So what Chabad essentially has done is to provide for every Jew who wishes to accept their version, their understanding of Torah Judaism. What they have done is to provide every Jew that which every Jew has always said he wants, and that is the Mashiach. Of course, many people don't understand what the Mashiach is, and what exactly it is that they claim that they want, what it is that they are praying for. But Chabad, at least, will tell you that we have a Mashiach, and he just happens to be our Rebbe. Whereas you are waiting for the Mashiach, you don't know anything about who he is, when he's coming, what he looks like, what his ideas were or will be. We know he just happens to be our Rebbe, and we know a lot about this Rebbe, and he is the Mashiach. And this is a fact today that all honest people in the know will admit to, namely that all Chabadnikim essentially, with almost no exceptions, believe that their last Rebbe is the Mashiach. The only real discussion amongst them nowadays is whether he is alive or dead. The fact that he passed away well over 20 years ago is not the point, not in their eyes. According to essentially all people who subscribe to Chabad Judaism, there is a Mashiach, and it is their Rebbe who is the Mashiach, and they have a very clear picture of how the Gula will play itself out. And I will relate to you here briefly what I was once told by a Chabad Jew some years ago, quite a few years ago, when I was in Melbourne, in Australia. And I was at a Shabbat table, and this person was sitting next to me, and he told me as follows. I mentioned something about living in Eretz Yisrael, moving to Eretz Yisrael, and he said, no, not at all. We are here in the Galuth until the Mashiach arrives. The Mashiach, of course, is the Rebbe, and we will not have to remove ourselves from Australia. We will not return to Eretz Yisrael physically, because all of the world, the entire world, will have the status of Eretz Yisrael. He's basing himself on a misinterpretation of a certain statement in the Talmud, which we won't go into now. And he went on to describe to me how every Erev Shabbat, every Friday before Shabbat, all the Jews in the world would, and their homes and their synagogues, their shuls, would be somehow teleported. They would levitate and be transported to Yerushalayim, to Jerusalem, next to the Mikdash, the temple, which would have been rebuilt. And they would spend Shabbat next to the Mikdash, and then they would be similarly returned to their homes, wherever they may be all over the world. This is how. This is one of the things, or one of the aspects of the Gula that he described to me according to his theology. And I do not believe for one moment that he made this up. He heard this from more learned and more experienced people in this mode, in this form of Jewish thought, and this particular sect within Judaism. So for those who subscribe to this sectarian view and this newfangled idea and version and concept of Torah Judaism, Chabad provides for such a person, provides them with a very comfortable and pleasant idea, concept of Geula, of redemption, which doesn't require them to do very much at all. It certainly doesn't require any effort on their part. It doesn't require moving to Eretz Yisrael. It provides for you already now, in the here and now. It provides you with a Mashiach, which you may not be able to see, and who may not be actually able to do very much at this point, so they would tell you, but he is there. According to some, he is alive, and he is the Mashiach already now. We already know this, and we have a special relationship with him. We are the people on the inner circle of the Jewish people. We know who the Mashiach is, and we have a special connection to him. And if you subscribe to the system, you belong to a large network of Jews around the world who, in the eyes of some people, perhaps many people, are very successful. And you no longer really have to be living in some kind of galuth reality. Essentially, you're already living in some form of geula, of redemption reality. And this also gives you perhaps pride and motivates you to do all sorts of things that other Jews find quite impossible to motivate themselves to do. You will only find people willing to leave a comfortable reality and move to some far-flung corner of the earth to set up a Bet Chabad at great personal sacrifice. You will only find people connected to Chabad willing to do such a thing, because such a system imbues people with tremendous excitement. This is an exciting form of Judaism. This is something which is not stagnant and dead or dying or boring or uninteresting or simply unclear. It's unclear. Where does Galut Judaism take you? Where are you going with it if you do not belong to such a system? Then you really don't know. Then you're in an eternal state of waiting, of becoming, but you don't know becoming what and when and how. Whereas if you belong to Chabad, then really everything's been laid out for you and everything is quite clear. And you can be extremely happy and pleased with yourself. And you may, but you don't have to do a great deal, but you might be motivated to do a tremendous amount of things, which include many positive actions which help and benefit many Jews around the world, a fact with which I am very familiar and no reasonable person could deny. Nevertheless, we are talking about a virtual, imaginary reality which has nothing to do with the real world, which has nothing to do with Torah Judaism. In this sense, it is a replacement theology. It replaces the true aims and purposes of the Jewish people, and it obviates the need for any great effort and planning and thought and action on the part of the Jewish people to bring about the real reality, the objective Torah-based reality of Geula. It removes all of that from the equation and replaces it with a feel-good virtual reality which, in the here and now at least, feels very good. It's warm and fuzzy and pleasant, and for a person who is somehow bamboozled into accepting such a thing, it feels very good and it is very pleasing. But this comes at great cost. This comes at the cost of distorting the true message and purpose of Judaism. This comes at the very great price of misleading people as to what Judaism is all about. Many people are convinced that Chabad are true representatives of Torah Judaism, and unfortunately one has to state plainly that this is not so. This is an aberration, and this is some form of mass hysteria, essentially. This is another example. Many have existed in history of people believing in things, intelligent and intellectual people very often even, believing in and accepting ideas and notions and claims which are entirely spurious. Just as in the time of Shabtai Tzvi, there were many people, including many great Rabbanim, who were misled by him and accepted his claims and thought that he was the Mashiach, because they wanted to believe it, because it was impossible really to continue Galut mode Judaism without any sign or reason for hope. In the same way, Chabad Judaism is able to be somehow internalized and accepted by many intelligent and very, very well-intentioned people, and I know many such people. But the fact remains, this is not the truth. This is replacement theology.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar Chaim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar Chaim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.